Okay. I'll just stay. I'll stay. Good. Hello? Hello? Is it good? Yeah? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. That was very quick. Lovely. Thank you for coming along to our session today. Very appreciative of the crowd we've drawn. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we meet on today, the Ngunnawal people and the Ngambri people. On behalf of our panel, I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, and acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I should have changed slide. So, for our panel today, we have myself, Jenna Hawes, Tony Kessler, Alice Tamong, and Braden Abala. I'll give a little bit of a brief introduction of each of our panel members before we get into the content of our presentation today. So next to me, we have Tony Kessler. He's an Aranda man and he's the Managing Director of Agriculture Consulting. And Tony has over 20 years experience in Indigenous and international development with an expertise in health systems, research, strategic planning and evaluation. Tony has recently advised DFAT on Indigenous participation in international development and he's on the board of the Australian Evaluation Society. He's also a researcher at the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance. Next on our panel we have Alice Tamong. Alice is a Darug woman and she's based in Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. Throughout Alice's career she's focused on equitable inclusion, community development and cultural revival across the education and arts sector. Alice consults on Indigenous inclusion internationally and brings her extensive experience working with First Nations communities across Australia in regional and remote locations through her role at the Australian Volunteers Program. Next, on the end of our table, we have Braden Abala, who's an Iwaja and Muriama man, also from the Torres Strait Islands, whose mobs extend from Daly River through to West Arnhem and Badu Island. Braden is an inclusion advisor for the Partnerships for Infrastructure program and he's based out of Bangkok in Thailand. Braden has, through Braden's role, he partners with Southeast Asia to foster inclusive growth through sustainable infrastructure. He also has an extensive experience in public policy and human services. And then on to myself. My name is Jenna Hawes. I'm a Wiradjuri woman from New South Wales and I'm the project manager for international development at NIMT1. Through my role, I work on increasing Indigenous participation in Australia's international development program, and my experience is in state government. Is this still working? Yes. State government across Western Australia, up in the Kimberley, and I've also worked in New South Wales. So yeah, that's our panel for today. For our session, we really want it to be a conversational session. We'll have, the panel at the beginning, and we really encourage everybody to ask questions and really encourage that engagement from the audience. So please don't be shy. I'm looking forward to your questions. So, let's reflect a little bit first on the Uluru Statement from the Heart and how that links into this sector. So, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was developed in 2017 and that called on Australian government for substantive structural reform so that First Nations Australians can be heard and have a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. So in practical terms, the Uluru Statement underscores the importance of DFAT's Indigenous Diplomacy Agenda in creating a dialogue for First Nations Australians to be recognised and included as an integral part of Australia's diplomatic and development endeavours. So very important. And speaking at the UN General Assembly this year, Senator the Honourable Penny Wong stated that the new Australian government is determined to make real progress on the national journey of healing with Indigenous Australians and see First Nations perspectives at the heart of Australian foreign policy. On Monday, I spoke with Professor Tom Calmer, who's the chair of NIMT1, the organisation I work for, about the Voice to Parliament and Australia's First Nations foreign policy, to get his thoughts on this area. Tom stated firstly the importance of the role that Indigenous people can play when it comes to development and the structures in the development sector. And secondly, Secondly, if Australia comes to a point of a referendum and we establish a voice to Parliament, the role will only have a role in the development if legislation is put forward to Parliament. And that may not be up until 2024, so there is quite a gap there. But in saying that, the news of the First Nations Ambassador can play a role in filling that gap and we expect this role to play an important part in promoting the involvement of more Indigenous peoples and working in international development and making those relationships across the region. In saying this, there are Indigenous people from Australia working in the region who have been for a very long time, and we have already seen quite large growth, which Tony will explore later on in our presentation, around how much that growth has gone in the last few years. But Tony, next to me, has had more than 20 years experience working in the sector, and I think it would be really important to hear from him around the changes that have happened since then. So my first question to you, Tony, is you've been working in the sector for more than 20 years. How do you see the changes in recent years panning out, and what additional efforts do you see going forward to create that further change?
Thanks, Jenna. And yeah, this puts me in the lucky position of being able to talk about the possibilities and the what could be, and we'll sort of get further into our discussion around different perspectives as well from our panel members as we go along. So some of what I'm talking about comes off the back of the advice that I've given to DFAT and other organisations in this space over the last few years, and looking at some of the things that have worked and maybe haven't worked so well, and where we can certainly do better. I want to reflect a little bit on Minister Conroy's speech yesterday that outlined the government's ongoing, or really quite clear commitment to First Nations foreign policy and engaging Indigenous people in our development space, talking about embedding First Nations perspectives in the new aid policy and changing both what we do and how we do it. So we'll hopefully get into some of that this through this presentation and see some good examples. I also want to tie in the Uluru Statement to one of the other big policy documents that we should refer to a little bit more, and we don't so much, which is the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which enshrines our right to self-determination. And for development, I would suggest that that means that Indigenous peoples must be included, engaged and empowered to set our own development agendas and to guide our programs, setting the policies, the priorities and the approaches that we take. That's not just Indigenous Australians. In that case, I'm talking about the work that we do in our region as well. And also connecting with another session I had the pleasure of attending yesterday on locally led development, and I think a lot of the same principles apply in what we're talking about today as in the stuff that we talk about with localisation. One of the colleagues is here. So it's looking at how can we, Australia, meaningfully engage with Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities in our region, and looking at areas where we need to move beyond the notion of locally managed programs and look towards locally led design and implementation in a more holistic way. We also need to note and reflect on Indigenous peoples being often amongst the most marginalised groups in their societies and in the societies that we're working with. So we need to establish purposeful mechanisms to ensure their engagement and empowerment in the processes that we're using. Our commitment as a sector should be measured by the degree to which we engage Indigenous people. Those Indigenous people are empowered, included and considered in the work that we're doing. So the other dimension beyond the sort of broad stuff around Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities and us representing some of those peoples in Australia is that Indigenous Australian dimension, engaging our First Nations in development policy, and that's from the Australian perspective. So that recognises and values Australia's Indigenous history and the way that we as a nation need to reflect on that, learn from that history and use that as part of explaining our story and where we are going as a nation in our development context as well. That involves creating space in representing Australia overseas, Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people representing Australia overseas, and that's part of the Indigenous Diplomacy Agenda. But that, I think, has got more room for development, and we look forward to seeing that develop over the next 12 months. It also sees our potential in building the relationships and partnerships and the respect within the region, and particularly in the Pacific, where we have a shared history and experience of colonisation. And that history has had a lasting effect on all of us. So connecting us and our stories and our way of working, I think, is a good way forward. Also, along with our Pacific colleagues, we are quite committed to decolonising international development, but from our perspective, it's from the other side. We'll work from the Australian side, and we're happy to work with our colleagues in the Pacific from the other side as well. So, what more can we do to increase our role and presence within foreign policy? And within development in particular. We still need a clear national strategy that guides us on what Indigenous participation looks like in development. We don't really have that guidance yet and that leadership. We don't have any targets, any workforce development strategy, or any clear definitions of participation and inclusion, and that really shapes where we are at the moment. There's no formal mechanisms that engage Australian First Nations in development. There's a lot of work going on, but there's nothing happening in a more coordinated way. And there's no coordinated approach to engaging with peoples in the region. That's across posts, across sectors and across programs as well. So that's beyond Indigenous Australians, and that's to other Indigenous peoples as well. We need to develop a shared understanding and commitment, and that's between development partners, Australia, and the different communities that we're working with, and bring together stakeholders and start that broad conversation. These will all hopefully be the first orders of business for the new First Nations ambassador when they are appointed by DFAT, and it will certainly be a very busy role enacting a very ambitious agenda. So we look forward to them starting in one day and working with them on that. Hopefully our session today can share some of our experiences.
Thanks, Tony. So you've given a really insightful background of where we're at now and where we are going forward. Now I'd like to ask Alice to speak more on Australian Volunteers, an existing program which has been pioneering in the space for quite a while. So please share.
And hello, everyone. So as Tony and Jenna have just mentioned, it's a really interesting and exciting time for First Nations involvement in international development. And it really feels like a big time of change in the sector, and I think as well within Australia generally. So we thought it would be good to delve into some current examples of embedding Indigenous people's perspectives in international development and talk about where there's opportunity to do more. So I work at the Australian Volunteers Program and I manage Indigenous pathways. And if you don't know the Australian Volunteers Program, it's DFAT's program managed by AVI in consortium with DT Global and Alinea International. The program supports skilled Australians to volunteer in 26 countries across the Pacific, Asia and parts of Africa. And the thing I love most about this program is that it involves learning and sharing across cultures. And Indigenous Pathways is a component of the program which is Indigenous designed and led. Tony and I co-designed the framework back in 2019, setting out the values, aspirations and strategy for how we envision meaningful inclusion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within international volunteering. The framework we designed covers program-wide approaches and activities that needed to be undertaken to achieve culturally safe inclusion. And this includes things like cultural safety, adaptive recruitment approaches, different entry pathways, targeted communications, and awareness building for our staff. It's taken a while to establish the structural side of things, as it needed careful thought and consideration, and it also takes quite a bit of time to bring people on the journey with you and build support. But now, a couple of years on, Indigenous Pathways is able to provide culturally safe, flexible and tailored support and opportunities. When setting up Pathways, a big thing I really wanted to do that's been significant for the program was to embed Indigenous voices within formal mechanisms. First Nations experiences across our country are so diverse, and as Indigenous Programs Manager, there's no way I can even try to represent all of them. It's also really important to know that mainstream program support structures may not feel culturally safe or appropriate for Indigenous volunteers, which is another reason why we established the Indigenous Volunteer Support and Advisory Panel. The panel is a formal structure that has a dual role of advising the program broadly on Indigenous participation, as well as providing support, guidance and mentoring. Indigenous volunteers can access the panel before, during and after their assignments so that they're able to build trust and receive consistent support throughout their volunteer journey. We've appointed 3 Indigenous panel members from really different backgrounds and all from different Aboriginal nations so that we can better represent a range of perspectives. We're really lucky to have Tony as one of our panel members. And the panel meet quarterly to discuss current Indigenous focus work within the Australian Volunteers Program, and our staff from Australia and overseas are able to join our meetings to seek advice from the panel or to have a yarn. Through embedding First Nations voices in leadership within the program, we're able to advocate for thoughtful and intentional programming that centres First Nations ways of working and supports localisation and decolonisation approaches. And this has been valuable at all levels, to volunteers, staff, partners and to DFAT. It's been particularly valuable to me as program manager because there's a lot to be said for being able to talk things through with your peers. And I think this can be particularly tough in a sector where there's very few Indigenous people working in it. So it's been really, really useful to share knowledge and information with the panel and to link up with other Indigenous professionals in the sector. It's also become increasingly important as the discussions around First Nations foreign policy and development become more prominent. We've also been connecting each other up. Through the panel, Tony has connected me with other Indigenous professionals working in the space, so Jenna, and then through meeting Jenna, we've kind of developed this presentation that we're giving today, which has been a lovely thing to work on over the past few months leading up to this. And so we've been kind of making these informal professional networks up as we go and learning from each other's works and sharing different programs and supporting each other. But with DFAT now developing a First Nations office and appointing a First Nations ambassador, there's a real opportunity for a more cohesive approach. And I'm so excited by that because there's so much opportunity for setting the tone of how Indigenous people's perspectives can be embedded in international development. I'm excited for what this means for our programs and for the way Australia engages globally.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a really awkward handover.
So I work for an organisation called Partnerships for Infrastructure, and it is a flagship infrastructure program in Southeast Asia that is funded through DFAT, and it has me embedded as a First Nations position within the core team, working in Southeast Asia with governments around the region. So part of my role is to think about how we increase engagement of Indigenous and marginalised ethnic minorities within the region in infrastructure builds within each of the countries within Southeast Asia. We're not working with Myanmar because they're in the bad corner at the moment, but we're working with the rest of them. And so, part of this work is being to try to connect different government departments in Australia with Southeast Asian governments to talk about how we can make infrastructure more inclusive of marginalised ethnic minorities and Indigenous people. It also includes other things. So I sit within a GEDSI team, so Gender Equality, Disability and Social Inclusion, and that's part of the role of P4I. And I think we have two great opportunities within P4I to utilise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander skills and knowledge to take that knowledge and work with governments across the world, and in my role it's working in Southeast Asia. And so that will mean that we start to look at how do we grab more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and bring them into the sector. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later because there are some difficulties that are in that space, particularly when there's 3% of us and everybody wants Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander talent right now. So the other thing that we do is we're looking at the Indigenous Diplomacy Agenda. So that is really that's a DFAT policy. So two of these policy drivers are pushing what I'm doing in this role. The IDA is about how do we make sure that Indigenous and ethnic minorities are included in this work? How do we influence governments to ensure that the rights of these groups are considered when we're looking at infrastructure? And the infrastructure that we're talking about, roads, digital and energy. So we've got to focus on those areas. The GEDSI team is a overcutting theme, or what do they call it? Yeah. A theme that runs through everything, as well as DRRCC, so disaster risk recovery and climate change. And we've got a government-to-government focus within the role. So basically it's a new role, it's a first, and I think that there will be lots to learn on this, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the M&E section. But that is to say that it is a consortium, and so within the consortium is DFAT. The lead agency is actually Ernst & Young, and it includes the Asia Foundation and Ninety One. And it was Ninety One's role and push that said if we're going to be part of this consortium, we should have an Aboriginal person embedded into the consortium to do that work. So with that, I'll hand back to Jenna.
I think Braden's role being embedded into the P4I program is a really good example of the work that we do at NINTI, trying to increase Indigenous participation within the aid program. There obviously are challenges. As Braden mentioned, 3% of Australia's population, it's a very small pool, and you're looking at a lot of the pool right here on this table today. But I think it's really important for an organisation like NINTI, who has a very, very long history of working in regional and remote communities within Australia, and translating that knowledge to see how we can work internationally, but also increasing that participation at the same time. very, very important. I think Minty's focus in the programs that we're involved in, which are in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and obviously the P4I program there, we're looking at Indigenous participation plans, recruitment, procurement, and then general knowledge sharing as well. We have some really great work that we've done. Similar to Braden, we've mobilised an Indigenous woman in Papua New Guinea, and also are working on some really exciting programs in terms of knowledge sharing with PNG and Australia. So very, very exciting. But I think it's also really important to mention, the limited research that has been done in this area. But the Whitlam Institute out of Western Sydney University has done some research a few years ago now that talked, to people in the Pacific, from the Pacific, about Indigenous participation. And, the main theme from them was, where are they? So that's really the work that I'm doing at the moment. It's an exciting space, as everybody's mentioned, and yeah, I love it. But next we will move on to talking a bit more about Indigenous participation. I hope I've got the right slide up, I do. And I'll hand over to Tony again. Thank you.
So yeah, the previous slide and the previous discussion, we focused more on the engagement side of things. This part of the discussion, we want to focus really on the practical part of participation, which is how to get more bums on seats, basically having more of us involved and engaged in the development sector. We're all going to reflect a little bit on our personal journeys into development and into the aid space. But before we get into that, a little bit of a reflection on where we are now as a group, not just us four, but everybody who's in this room today as well. This diagram, and I'll give credit to Joel and his colleagues at INDEV for developing, and you've probably seen that come out in the last week or so, and I asked Joel if it would be all right if I used that, because I think it really helps us look at where do the Indigenous organisations sit in this map, and there's a few little ones in there, and Ninti's one of the bigger ones, and I2I as well, so a bit of a shout out to our other friends. You can see that we don't really make up a large part of that diagram yet, and we probably will never make up a large part of that diagram, but it's important that we're up there and that we're included as well. The other way that we need to be engaged is through all those other organisations, and I haven't listed, there's a bit up there that says examples of First Nations inclusive organisations. It's not all of you. We've worked with most of the organisations up there, but this is specifically the ones that we're currently substantively employed by, so that's how we defined it. But actually we would like to see that group increase quite a bit too, which is have more long-term substantive Indigenous employees engaged in the sector and in the work that we're doing. I think it's important at this point to also reflect on aid and development not really being a natural choice, natural career choice for Indigenous Australians. It should be. We have a lot of experience for working with our own communities. A lot of us have actually gained our experience first domestically working with our own communities on the issues that affect us, and we've been able to take that experience into development. But there are lots of risks in changing career that a lot of people need to consider about what are they going to do with their families and so on if there's not a long-term role that they're moving into. So a lot of the roles that we have in development are contract roles, and it's not necessarily conducive to people giving up a career to come across. Development's also really not well understood in the broader Indigenous community. It's not something that we've been engaged with as a community, and not something that the development sector is necessarily engaged well with in terms of sharing those messages. It's because we don't work in Australia, us, the international community. So having an ability for people to have a better understanding will help as well. And finally, there are not really strong pathways yet. Alice's program is one of the earlier ones now, starting in that, looking at pathways to help people transition their experience into development. I think we can also all agree that the Indigenous participation plans that we currently work to and work with in development, particularly on the tendered programs, are not working particularly well at increasing Indigenous participation within the sector. We are seeing some good examples like Braden, for example, but actually considering the amount of programs and the amount of work that's happening, there are very, very few Indigenous people engaged on different programs. I think that in terms of improving that, we don't have any targets usually set within the programs that we're working on. The commitments are not really assessed at tender or following the implementation of the program. And broadly, that work's not particularly well resourced by DFAT. The expectation is that this is a cost of management of the program, and so that's never going to work particularly well I think that we need to really reflect on the way we currently do it now and see if there isn't a better way to do it. So we'll flag that. We don't have an answer for it yet, but there's surely a better way. There are, as I mentioned, quite a few positive stories, and one of the more positive ones is I did a little bit of a quick back-of-the-envelope maths for the people that we know who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander and are substantively working in the sector. And if we jump in 2-year intervals and we go right back to 2018, we were aware of one Indigenous person working in development. If we jump forward to 2020, at this very conference in 2020, there were 3 Indigenous people engaged in the conference. 2 were on different panels, Alice was one of them, and 1 in the audience, which was me. And finally, we jump now to today, and we revised this maths. We have 11 Indigenous people that we're aware of currently working in development. 4 are on a panel. 4 are somewhere either in this audience or another audience, and 3 haven't been able to attend the conference this year. So we're starting to grow in numbers, and that's quite positive. I think we've still got a little bit more to go, and I did some further maths, which puts us at, if we keep growing at that rate, we'll have 33 Indigenous faces in development, and 24 of them will be at this conference in 2024. So how do we get there? How do we get to that 33 people or more? We need to help make that transition easier for people to think about careers in development. Just talking on that topic alone could be a whole session, but we'll hopefully be able to discuss some of the detail of that as the questions come along. But particularly looking at how do we use and bring the skills and experience that people have in their work domestically and bring that across. So that's looking at it from our point of view, but also looking at First Nations, so Indigenous people and ethnic minorities in other regions, and looking at similarly how can we engage those groups in our programs as well. So it's not just localisation, it's about localisation and indigenisation, I suppose you could say, in some ways, so making sure that we include those groups as well. For domestic stuff, I think that there's a lot of potential in working with organisations like the Coalition of the Peaks and their membership. The Coalition of the Peaks is the peak representative body of Indigenous community-controlled organisations in Australia. They have membership including health sector, education, law and justice. I'm looking at you. There's lots and lots of different organisations with lots of really diverse experience. And I think if we can connect in and engage with those groups and start to create those pathways and connections, I think we'll have, be able to demystify some of this development stuff for people and for communities and organisations. We also need to make sure that our recruitment processes are really supportive, safe and inclusive. At the moment, there's not a lot of targeted particular Indigenous recruitment happening in development. That is common in other industries. So if we as a sector really are committed to that, we need to start thinking about how do we do more specialised recruitment processes, and that's really how most of us have come into roles as well. Reflecting back on me saying earlier, having more bums on seats, if we only focus on that, we do also risk being quite exploitative. We need to think about how do we create a more sustainable approach to recruitment and workforce development in general. There are fairly limited entry-level positions into development. I think that's true for any new professional who wants to come in, but it's particularly so for Indigenous professionals or Indigenous people starting out their careers. So we should really be looking at things like that and internships, and there are some organisations that have internships that are leading through to career jobs as well, so that's really good to see. We should also look at things like cadetships. The federal government has run Indigenous cadetships for a number of decades now. It's actually how I started in the federal government once upon a time, where people at university are recruited and engaged straight into what will lead to a career job when they finish their studies. We also need to look at young professional programs and things like that through the UN system and other organisations and development partners that we're connected with, just so that we have that diversity of experience and opportunity for people. This will all require quite a lot of resourcing and commitment, and particularly from DFAT as the leader in this space and the person who holds all the money bags in that sense. So we need to see that commitment and leadership, and again I put that on the shoulders of the First Nations ambassador. Hopefully they'll be able to take that agenda forward as they come in and see that some of that stuff will be able to happen. I think we can agree that the market-based approach that we have now, while it has some successes, presents potentially more risks and harm in going forward, then we are seeing good. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but we can certainly improve that system with different incentives and different approaches. But in saying all that, I'm really very positive, and I feel that we're in a real time for change for Indigenous participation, particularly in our sector, but broadly in society as well. And I think as I hand across, we have some really inspiring stories, personal stories about these guys' entries into their careers, and hopefully give some good inspiration as we head forward. Thanks. Handing over to Jenna.
Thanks, Tony. And I just wanted to talk about the need for a different approach before I get onto a story. And I think it's really important to look at, NINTI's 2 successful appointments of Indigenous people on aid programs. And, those roles have been, different and focused and targeted. It doesn't always work if you just get sent a job ad to say, share to your networks, because, with a limited pool, those roles that have very experienced people, like Tony, like some of the others on the panel, they're already in roles, they're in very high demand. So it's really important to start thinking differently outside of the box. And it often is hard to do when you're working within a structure. But I think if, any real change was to occur, that would be how it would be done. So just a thought to ponder on there. I'd like to talk a little bit more about my journey into this area, and I think it's a really good example of opportunity, but also where there is lack of opportunity too. So I went to university at the University of Newcastle. I studied a Bachelor of Development Studies, which I absolutely loved. The University of Newcastle had a program that offered Indigenous and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies as core courses in the program, which is quite different to other universities, which I'll get to after, but really links well with my role now. Following university, the pathways. What was I to do? Not much, really, in terms of international development. I could have gone and done an unpaid internship, which is very popular in the sector, unfortunately, but I couldn't afford to do that. I had to pay my rent. I had to live. I can't, I don't have, the financial support to back me up to go and, work overseas without getting paid. So I think, looking at that in terms of, how we can get more people, I think that's a really important point, looking at how we can get paid opportunities for people so they can support themselves and also support families, their families in particular. So from there, I went and worked for the government for 2 years, worked for an NGO, which really gave me that project management experience now as my project manager, so it makes sense. And I was finally able to kind of pull those two together. But, I had a couple of years where I really wanted to work in development, but I didn't know how to get there. There wasn't really any engagement from the sector in terms of what I could see. Maybe it was my university, I don't know, but in terms of how I can get into that. So I think it's really important to start looking at that engagement for students and young people in terms of how they want to get into the sector in really meaningful positions, which I'm very, very grateful to be in a position I love now. But it did take a couple of years. I don't regret that at all because I've built that experience, but I think it's just really important to start looking at those pathways and how you can support young people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also people from other ethnic backgrounds in Australia who are also underrepresented in Australia's aid program. So yeah, that's all from me. We'll go on to Alice again now.
So I talked a bit before about some of the structures that we've set up to ensure that our program feels culturally safe, but that's really only one of the first steps in terms of increasing engagement, because I think there's a much broader awareness piece to be done across all levels. Awareness for individuals, for programs, for donors, and for international partners. As First Nations peoples, we're uniquely placed to combine our professional and personal experiences with our understanding of the importance of culture, communication, and sustainability in development. But Tony's right in saying that international development is not necessarily a natural choice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's something I definitely felt when I first joined the sector. I'd spent most of my career working in Aboriginal organisations that were often quite a lot smaller and only focused on domestic work, and I hadn't considered international work at all. I remember coming into this and it seemed like a bit of a random thing to be doing because I know that we have a lot of challenges in our own communities, and I was just like, why would I go and do something overseas when I could work here? But I think it's really important, so for that reason I think is one of them, to build an awareness of what opportunities there are for Indigenous people within international development, whether it be as a program manager, a volunteer, a consultant, a supplier, and how the things we learn when working in this space can also be brought back to our own communities to drive change. And if we're going to build more First Nations involvement in the sector, it's critical for opportunities to be relevant and appealing. It's not good enough to just get people involved in any old way and say that you've met a participation target, because if people don't feel valued, meaningfully engaged, and see the relevance, it's not going to result in long-term engagement. As part of Indigenous Pathways, we've committed to promoting the excellence and unique skills and insights of First Nations Australians internationally and providing meaningful opportunities for knowledge sharing and connection across the region that we're working in. A critical part of our approach is to look at areas of Indigenous strength and expertise within our own communities and organisations, and then work really closely with our in-country teams to build connections with partner organisations that have strong similarities and alignment. And for me, we work across 26 countries, but I think countries in the Pacific is where we've seen really, really strong engagement, and I work really closely with Pacific colleagues. So engaging and partnering with Indigenous-led programs and organisations is really important, and it helps ensure that First Nations people have access to significant opportunities for connection and knowledge exchange across cultures, with a focus on mutually beneficial projects that provide strong outcomes for international partners. A really great example of this is a new partnership we've recently developed with WWF Australia. And within WWF, they manage the Indigenous Women's Ranger Network, headed up by an amazing First Nations woman, Rosie. And the network is a connection point for female rangers from across Australia who are all working on land and sea conservation and climate change mitigation and resilience. We're currently co-designing opportunities with WWF for female Indigenous rangers to share skills and knowledge with women working in conservation in the Pacific. We can see lots of strong connections and similarities between the contexts and the work being done, and it just highlights the importance of finding and focusing on those areas of strength. Of equal importance is working with individuals and tailoring opportunities for engagement. We have a process within Indigenous Pathways where people can contact me to express interest, and then I'll work with our in-country teams to match them up with partner organisations working in the same areas. A good example of this is a Torres Strait Islander human rights and climate change lawyer who I met with earlier in the year. We had a long informal lunch chatting about her skills and interests, as well as the flexibility and support she might need, as she's also completing her PhD. She expressed interest, and I then contacted a few of our in-country teams, and they came back to me saying that Asia Justice and Rights based in Indonesia would be a really good fit. So we got the partner organisation and the potential volunteer together on Zoom to meet, and it was like watching a panel discussion because they just were having these fantastic conversations, and it was clear to all of us that it was such a great fit. So last week an assignment was just co-designed. We got the assignment description, and it's scheduled for March next year, which is really exciting. So it's that kind of co-design that really works well for inclusive practice, and it helps build awareness of diverse skill sets. And now I've got international staff coming to me specifically for Indigenous volunteers because they recognise unique skills and strengths that can support program partners, and they're excited to get involved. This is also part of the broader awareness piece, sharing who we are as First Nations people, the diversity of our knowledge and professional expertise. And slowly but surely, we're building awareness within our organisation, with donors and with international partners, that we need to consider all different types of skills, as well as different ways of designing opportunities and engaging people.
Okay,
that's you. Sorry, I'm bad at the handovers.
I wanted to reflect on a couple of things that were said. Tony talked about the fact that we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been working with our communities since day dot, so we know development, and I think that's part of the skill set that we need to acknowledge, is that we do have these skills with us and they can be transitioned quite easily. The other thing though that Alice said that I think is really important, and that is that it needs to be meaningful, otherwise we're not going to do it. And so in telling you those two reflections, I'll tell you about my journey in this space. I started with AAD, Australian Youth Ambassadors for Development, back in 2003, before it was cut out of the development system. And my experience there left me not in a good place. So I felt that the work that I was doing in some ways was actually colonising the people of Cambodia in the discussions that I was having with them. So I walked away from development altogether. and I came back to Australia because I wanted to give back to my community. So I came back and I spent the last 20 odd years in health and human services, so child protection work, disabilities, health. And it was this job that got me back into development, because for me it was meaningful that there was now an opportunity for me to work with a whole bunch of nations in the region to make sure that those governments could start to look at and care for their Indigenous and marginalised ethnic minorities. So I kind of think I came home, I invested in my community here, I gave a lot, and now I can take that overseas and give it to other nations and other people, and hopefully make a difference there. So we're talking a little bit about participation, and I think I mentioned it before. I was a little bit nervous. So Indigenous procurement policy is a driver for me in this role. So that is, how do we bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders with us on this journey? And again, it needs to be meaningful. So we can't just get bums on seats and then people leave. So there's that particular aspect of it. And so part of my coming back here for this conference is actually to go and try and engage with some of the universities in Australia to say, do you have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are studying in development, or are they studying infrastructure, are they studying in energy, digital, roads, whatever, so that we can grab those people and introduce them to development, and it may be an opportunity for them to get engaged. It also will do a big tick for DFAT, because it will say, we are starting to build the pipeline of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been exposed to development and who can move into development. So that's a key area for me on my visit back this time. And what else have I got here? Yeah, and I think just echoing what Jenna was saying before, we need to think about how we do this differently, because depending on where you are on your life journey, I mean, if you're just getting out of uni and then you want to go and get a development job, which you don't necessarily get paid super, and so that is a big issue for some people. And then there are other people who then have families and they establish those families, and unless you get a really good, well-paid, secure job, you're not going to uplift everyone and move. And at beginnings of your careers in this space, you don't necessarily get those well-paid positions that will do that stuff for you. So again, it's just thinking about how do we do this differently, how do we expose Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and people who may be early in their careers or late in their careers, and recognising that regardless of what jobs people are currently doing, they can transition into development because the skills are already there. It's just about giving people that acknowledgement that they are actually doing the work and they can do it. And that's me.
Thanks, Braden. Really appreciative of your points around transferring skills and investing in relationships as well. We'll change the slide and now start talking about measuring performance, results, and sharing best practice. I would like to firstly talk about relationships and what that could potentially look like and what it does look like, but as everybody on the panel has mentioned previously, investing in long-term relationships is really important. For example, getting on a bid once, cutting ties, that's not a long-term meaningful relationship that would be ideal in this sector. And I think, really starting from scratch and building onto that is very, very important. I think at NINTI we share best practice through that program is based on our experience, and we are somewhat of a natural resource for enabling, linking and developing and facilitating that best practice through both contractual and natural partnerships. So we have the programs that we work on, but we also have a lot of conversations outside of those programs as well, which I would like to think are very valuable. Another thing is, just that networking between Indigenous people. Like we've mentioned before, that's how the panel got together. And it was thanks to an organisation like NINTI and the relationships that we had with Tony, with Braden, with Alice, in how we could get that together. So again, long-term strategies, relationships are really important. But I'll pass it to Braden now to talk about P4I's approach to Indigenous participation and how that is quite unique.
Thanks. I'm going to be doing a lot of reading because I didn't do a lot of planning on this particular component. As my role as one of the first in the region, I think, to embed an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person into a development agency doing work in the region, I think DFAT has a lot to gain from monitoring how this program works and moves forward, so that we can share that with other maybe consortiums in the future to show how it can be done in a socially inclusive way that is culturally safe, and it can be done. So I think using something like this as a flagship, DFAT may actually start looking at programming moving forward to say, do we make this more standardised? So do we think about embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the future in more programs? And I think that that's what will need to happen. So in this regard, M&E, so monitoring and evaluation, can enhance Indigenous participation in other programs and across other DFAT-funded programs into the future. I've got here that, I think I've said this before, so that we carry with us the skills of working in the development space anyway, so it's about how do we transition that within the Australian context, and understanding that diplomacy and specific characteristics of local context while working with others to build support for larger Indigenous communities around the globe. And so just to end on the fact that I'm actually in an infrastructure role and I come from health and human services, so very, very different roles. And so while it's an amazing opportunity for me and I'm really loving it, there are other opportunities for DFAT to think about how do we actually engage in those strength areas where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia are working in health and human services. So why are we not looking at in environmental spaces, human services, health and wellbeing for the future? And that's me transitioning to Tony to now talk about his M&E background.
We have little notes here about who's going next. We have to try and remember. It's one of the joys of doing a joint presentation. I quite like the idea of talking about results and performance. My majority of my work is in planning strategy and M&E, so I'm very focused on action and results. So I could talk for many hours about this, but I won't bore you too long. I've already mentioned my concerns with the lack of targets, performance measures, and even a strategy to take us forward in this space. I think that we can only really create and sustain change in this area if we are working towards a clear plan. So we really need one of those. We need in that plan clear targets that benchmark our performance in this space, that show that we're doing a good job, and that leadership needs to come from DFAT, who are the sort of our stewards in this space, to bring us all together around a shared purpose, around shared objectives for increasing Indigenous participation. Doing that properly requires us to co-design that approach with First Nations Australians and have that shared understanding between community, between development partners and between DFAT on how it all should go forward and what success looks like. We really need to do that for the macro level for the sector, but we also need to look at every design that we're doing in every country that will impact Indigenous peoples groups and engage those different Indigenous peoples groups, ethnic minorities and so forth in the design of those programs if we're genuinely committed to this idea of inclusiveness. It's not something that we do in a particularly organised way at the moment. Some programs are doing it and maybe doing it well, but we haven't really got that coordinated direction yet around how to do that. I don't think that we can leave that to the market to decide. At the moment, a lot of stuff is done by, design, implement models and so forth, where we let that happen as part of the process later on. I think we need to set some of those directions prior to getting to that stage. And that, again, comes back to leadership from DFAT in this space. I'm very critical of DFAT today. I don't mean to be. They're my friends too. We also need very purposeful mechanisms and requirements that standardisations across programs that guide our work, and that comes back to some of that, program level work and country level work that I was talking about. We need to look at how Indigenous peoples will be impacted and how we can sort of mitigate that and put safeguards in place early on. So don't just sort of jump in, have an idea before you get in there about what and how you should be doing things appropriately. And then measures which are sort of part of that co-design process about what are the expectations of what is appropriate engagement from that community, and have you met those expectations? Also, what does participation look like in the context that you're working on at that time, and whether or not it was achieved? I think that we can only really measure against agreed targets at the outset, so don't try and, this is typical M&E anyway, don't try and jump in and get it all done and then set your targets later, because you'll always probably achieve those. So yeah, make sure that you've set some ambitious targets to begin with. We can only know if we're successful if we plan to be successful in the first place, and then we can only learn next time if we know if we've missed that mark. So I hope that we can reflect a little bit on that going forward in our discussions here, because if we're genuinely committed to the idea of First Nations participation and inclusion in development, we really need to have some of that stuff more bedded down than we have now. So now I get to hand over to Alice.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, so having the time and space to design and establish programs means that we'll also need to put significant effort into planning and investing in relationships. At the Australian Volunteers Program, for us, it's a really important way of knowing that we're doing things the right way is the quality of the relationships, the partnerships, and the richness of the knowledge exchange. Because at the core of everything, it's strong, equitable, people-to-people relationships that will drive development and provide long-term mutual benefit to participants and partners, and if done right, will outlast program and budget cycles. So focusing on those long-term, meaningful engagements is a core part of our way of working, and it involves doing things differently. We've been working to engage with Indigenous organisations, as I mentioned before, and we've also been taking a considered approach to ensure that our international colleagues and partners are involved in early conversations, because ultimately we need to make sure that projects are the best fit for the context and are culturally appropriate. Usually, when engaging with potential Australian partners in Australia, it's Australian-based staff who are at the initial meetings, holding and developing that relationship, and then international staff are brought in later. But why shouldn't international staff be involved right from the beginning? I'd like to talk about two of my colleagues that I work closely with, Eve, who is in the Solomon Islands as our country program manager, and Apai, who's the Deputy Regional Director of the Pacific. They're also both Indigenous peoples and are passionate about opportunities within a global program where we can connect and share across cultures. They've been involved in the co-design work I was talking about before, and so earlier this year, when I was planning an Indigenous Pathways engagement trip to the Torres Strait Islands to start brokering partnerships, it made perfect sense for Eve and Apai to be a part of it, because for us to truly set up projects with meaning in a meaningful and equitable way, we need to have the right people in the room from the start. And this was a unique approach for the Australian Volunteers Program, because it was the first time that I think we know of that in-country staff have been involved in the initial engagement with Australian organisations. Eve and Apai travelled to Australia in August, and we all spent a week in the Torres Strait Islands meeting with people and organisations. Indigenous ways of working were central to the success of our visit. As the program had never previously engaged in the Torres Strait before, scheduling a full calendar of meetings prior to arriving was not appropriate, and it wasn't going to work for us. So instead, we only set up 2 key meetings right at the beginning of the week, and prior to arriving, at the beginning of the week, and then we relied on the trust we built with organisations, the relationships when we went with people at the start, for them to make introductions and suggest who we should go and speak to next. And that meant that relationships were built in a natural and genuine way, and Eve and Apai were also very comfortable with this approach because they said it's the way that they work in the Pacific. And we had such an incredible week of meetings. We were really, really surprised by the amount of people we met. It was 37 people across 11 organisations within the space of 6 days. So it was incredibly busy, and word kind of travelled around community that we were there, and people would stop us in the supermarket, or someone would call the Indigenous Pathways phone, and we'd be having meetings on the beach or at a picnic table, and it was just really, really lovely and felt very comfortable. I can't really even scrape the surface of explaining how significant that trip was to myself, Eve and Apai, but also, I guess, to our organisation. When we were up there, organisations and community members were so interested in hearing from Eve and Apai about their countries and the work that partner organisations in the Pacific were doing. And I think that really helped people to immediately draw connections as to, why they might want to be involved in the Australian Volunteers Program and how it could be relevant to them. People were drawing, cultural connections, geographical similarities, and historical links between our countries and communities. And even I didn't realise how deep that those connections would be. Eve and Apai were also able to gain a strong understanding of ways of working in First Nations communities here. And that's playing a part in how the three of us are shaping programming and how they're able to share information with partners back in their home countries about, what they saw when they were meeting with organisations. From there, we're progressing a number of pieces of work that have come out of that trip, including developing partnerships with the Torres Strait Regional Authority, a peak body who cover a range of areas such as conservation, health and community safety. And I think one of the really interesting things that has come out of this that probably surprised myself, Eve and Apai, is that the impact it's had on shifting thinking regarding localisation and decolonisation approaches within our organisation. We all were really, throughout the trip, Eve, Apai and I all started to realise how much of a significant trip it was, and so we were really purposeful in sharing the learnings of that trip and wrote up a report and shared it with our regional directors and a really large number of senior leadership and general staff. And I think the learnings and successes from our approaches really resonated with colleagues, and it sparked so many conversations about partnerships, better balancing power, and how broader program areas can learn from Indigenous approaches. And I think that really highlights that First Nations perspectives and ways of working have a strong place in development and foreign policy, because by sharing our work and the ways that we work differently, it opens up conversations and builds awareness about, different types of programming. So we're all really glad, as the panel here today, to have the opportunity to share our perspectives and learnings with you. And we hope that it's been thought-provoking. So thank you for having us. And we've got time for questions, so I will hand over to Jenna, who's going to manage that process.
Thank you. So we have, I believe, gone over time a little bit in terms of our presentation, but we could not stop with that amazing story at the end. So we'll try and keep questions quite concise. We'll just do one at a time. If you can introduce who you are, where you're from, that would be great. And let's go. Anyone have any questions?
Hi, my name's Judy Putt. I'm from the ANU here. Just thinking about what Ofa said yesterday in her keynote address, and that that tendency that we have to go to them to tell them what to do, and the lack of acknowledgement of the work that happens within Tonga is the example she was giving. I'm just wondering about whether you feel that there's that risk in a sense of still us going to them. So you're talking about the experiences of Indigenous Australians and what's been learned and imparting that. And I can see that non-Indigenous Australians would benefit greatly from that, but it's more where you go offshore. And so that's just the question.
I think a first comment from me would be when we finished listening to that session yesterday, it made sense to us. It's, our thinking already about everything Ofa said, but you could tell in the room that it could have been new information to some people. So I guess that just shows that different way of thinking, but I'm not sure if anyone else has any answers to the rest of the question.
Yeah, I think, with international development, there's always a risk of that. But I guess something that is unique about our experiences as First Nations people within Australia is that we've had over 200 years of development pushed upon us, and we know what that feels like for our communities. We know the harm that it does and the lasting impact it causes. And so I think that, when we come into international development work, there's a real base understanding of not wanting to do that because that's what's been done to us. So I think that fundamentally changes the way we engage with people internationally and engage with communities. And I think for me at the Australian Volunteers Program, the most exciting part of my role is being able to engage with international colleagues and hear from them and work with them and, be able to have them lead things. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Lauren from Friends of Family PNG. I'm just wondering if the panel has some thoughts on how to support First Nations practitioners in their organisations. One of the reasons I left the New Zealand House system was the difficulty of being expected to be the Māori voice in the room every day. And I think just thinking about how we can not overwhelm staff when they come in, expecting them to immediately turn around and be all of the voice.
I'm happy to.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and because while we're coming in relatively small numbers and it's the beginning, we certainly have the risk of being the only Indigenous person in an organisation and becoming the sort of source of all knowledge. So I think having, we talked about inclusive environments and so on, and inclusive recruitment, and that all goes to how do you bring somebody on board in your organisation who is Indigenous, what do you need to consider, how do you need to consider about them in the workplace, and skilling up your workplace to work with that person as well, and making sure people are aware of what's culturally appropriate and culturally safe for that employee. That's a well-advanced area of work now within Australia, so it's certainly something that we in development can draw on if we need to. But at the same time, I think that most people will come into a role and be happy to share that experience in a sort of a supported way and in a supportive way, an inclusive way. So, you know, at the same time, I'm saying be careful with how much you ask. Don't just leave them sitting on the side either. So yeah, have a really good think as an organisation before you bring somebody on board about how you want to work as an organisation with that person and vice versa, and what kind of environment you want to create.
I want to say something quick. So it's a bit like in health, you can be a professional clinician and you can be an Indigenous First Nations person. And so when I was in Western Sydney Local Health District, one of the things that I wanted to do is to make sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff who were there doing work as a doctor, as a nurse, they were doing their jobs in those roles. They weren't the Aboriginal voice. So there are other roles that are specifically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and they have the responsibility of carrying what you're talking about. So I think it is a bit of a balancing act, as Tony said. You need to, I think, if a person is there to do a role that is not facing the community or with a specific agenda around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous, whatever, then they should be left to do their technical skilled job. Mm.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Francette Dusan from the Indo-Pacific Centre for Health Security at DFAT. I've got a couple of questions I'm going to sneak in, only because Tony and Alice might want to take this outside. But I'm really interested in how you monitor the strength of the partnerships and how you incorporate that into your frameworks going forward. And then just wanted to ask Braden, we've learnt a lot about the clear connection with Pacific Island countries, but you're working in Southeast Asia, and I just wanted to ask if you wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about maybe the challenges you face there that are different to the Pacific Island country context.
Okay, wow. Well, we could be here for a while. Oh, yeah, you guys go.
How do you measure the strength of a partnership? And you mean particularly a partnership with First Nations communities and or organisations, I assume. There's a lot of different ways, but some of the key elements to that is how did you set out about engaging with that community or that organisation? How did you ensure that they had a voice in the process at the very outset, at the very stage of design of an activity or whatever you're working on? Did they influence the way that activity started to shape up, and how were their voices included in that process? So I'd say that's where you need to start in terms of looking at how do you measure the impact of that. So you start with did you include them first, and then how much has that inclusion actually impacted the way that you've done your work. I had the pleasure of talking with one organisation who is not part of this conference or our sector, so I think I can use it as an example, recently, that said, but what if we don't agree with the voice that, with what that group of people has said? That's one of the risks you take on board. If you want to be inclusive, you have to think about how to be inclusive and how you will get different opinions. And actually, I think that if you really sit back and reflect, there might be some really important gems in there about how you can make your program better.
Okay.
I think... No, you can go first. Okay. Sorry.
Well, it's a massive challenge. So Southeast Asia is home to 260 million Indigenous or ethnic minority peoples. And I think when you put that in the context of it is 10 times the population of Australia, that is a big thing. I think, so some of the challenges of P4I is that it sits at a position where we are working with governments to try and influence the way that they work with their Indigenous and ethnically marginalised groups. And so we're not actually doing on-the-ground stuff, which is very different. So then on top of that, I don't know if there are many people from Southeast Asia in the room, but there are lots of different ways of looking at Indigenous. So the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has an assumption that sits under it that the colonisers are still in the room. And so for a lot of Southeast Asia, they were either not colonised or they may have been colonised 3 times and they kicked them out. And so it's a very different dynamic. Some Southeast Asian communities recognise Indigenous and have a strong set of legislative responsibilities that sit around that, and others say everybody in the room is Indigenous, so we're all ethnically marginalised, or we're all ethnic, and so it's about trying to recognise those marginalised groups that sit within those communities where there are large ethnically diverse groups. So those are just a couple of challenges. Thank you.
I kind of thought about it a bit while you were talking. And I think in terms of your question to like the measuring the strengths of partnerships and relationships, something I guess a way to look at it is that when you're kind of going into it, not necessarily going in with an agenda. So for the Volunteers program and for Pathways, it's what I look at is matching up people and organisations with our partner organisations internationally and letting them get together and do the co-design and talk about their areas of strength and interest. And so for me, measuring that looks like kind of looking at what assignment they've developed together and seeing how much they've each contributed to it. Because if it's something that I've kind of set up and designed for them, it's clearly not been a very good partnership or relationship because it shouldn't have my touch in it. It should be both sides of the partnership working together and developing that. And yeah, so I think that's a good way of looking at it.
Thank you. Let's try to keep it to one question if we can, if we have a lot, but I think we had one over here, just at the top there.
The Development Intelligence Lab. Thank you guys so much for sharing your insights today. I'm really curious. I think what I've picked up on is it's potentially about bums on seats and participation. So we're talking about early engagement and inclusive procurement, but really it's about making those experiences as meaningful as they can be. And I think you've all touched on that today. So what I really wanted to know is if you guys had any advice for us in the development sector, how to make those the most meaningful experiences. I know we're talking about time-poor people who are clearly in very high demand. Alice, you talked about having the right people in the room and that co-design, but I'm wondering if any of the other members of the panel had advice or meaningful experiences that they've either been through themselves or that they've been a part of. Thank you.
Happy to answer at least that one. I think just generally when you're looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, we're often asked to share our information and share our knowledge unpaid. And I think that's one really important thing to mention, that, this knowledge that has been developed for so many years doesn't come for free. So really making sure that that is, thought of before. But I think also coming into conversations where you're trying to look at that meaningful participation is just doing general background research, understanding, what has already happened in international development in regards to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, what the direction is, and where that could go, and just really understanding the background. So you're coming into a conversation, somewhat knowledgeable, and then you can grow on that rather than starting from scratch, because really it would be not the best use of that person's time either. So yeah, really important.
Sorry, Alopi. Hi, Alopi Latikefu from DFAT. I was quite interested in your reflections on emerging talent and talent identification. I'd like to get some more thoughts from you in terms of identifying young First Nations talent and how to bring them into the development context, and whether or not it is through domestic organisations like we have across Australia, or directly into the development field. Thank you.
Thanks. I think probably starting by, it's not an and/or. I think you probably need to do all of those things. You need to look at where you can draw on a pool of emerging talent within the Indigenous community sector, noting that you don't want to drain that sector either, and that a lot of people are going to be quite passionate about staying and working in that sector. So there will, however, be some opportunities where people are quite keen on taking their experience over into international development, but may not see a pathway yet to do that. That's one of the things that we considered in designing the Indigenous pathways, or what we called it Indigenous pathways, for the volunteer program, which is, how do you take your experience and that interest in working overseas and move forward? So that's one aspect. The other one, which is around, whether or not you need to look at targeted programs. I think that there's university, Braden already mentioned it, going off and seeing the universities. There are a lot of people who are doing studies like Jenna did, who will have an interest in development but may not see that opportunity arise. And what can we do as a sector, whether that be DFAT as an organisation, whether that be the managing contractors, the different development programs, NGOs and so on. We all have a role to play in terms of creating that space and those opportunities to make them clear to people, and to actually target our recruitment if we want to get those people to think about coming in and starting in a career there. There's a lot of feeder pathways. I really couldn't go into them all. But in terms of DFAT as well, a lot of the people that we see working in development have had, I don't know, actually that's probably not a fair call. Maybe not a lot of the people we see working in development have come out of DFAT and gone into the outside world. But some of us have passed in and through the organisation and gained experience that way. But certainly as a government organisation, you have different avenues to the sector where you can bring people in and introduce them in a very safe environment, a very secure environment, and then that, maybe encouraging them to move on from DFAT, not just stay inside like they have.
Hello, I'm wondering, me right here, yeah. Okay, so I'm from Indonesia. I'm wondering whether, are you also involving people with disabilities in Indigenous group that you are with? Since Indonesia is, Indonesia is big and a lot of Indigenous people is living in rural areas, and the rural areas obviously not accessible for people with disabilities. So do you have any comments on that, since it's not accessible at all, and also that's a big issue also for people with disabilities, especially for any access, not only just for physical disabilities, but also for deaf people that need information, but a lot of things that are happening in their own local languages, which Indonesia has hundreds local languages. That's also the problem. Thank you.
I think, so part of the role for P4I is in that space. I think it's about working with governments to recognise where there are opportunities for infrastructure to have a positive impact on the lives of Indigenous and ethnic minorities, whether that's engaging them so that they're able to get to hospital and health services more easily, or whether it's they're able to get their produce or part of their artefacts to the shops and stuff like that. So, but in doing so, P4I wants to work with governments to showcase how we have done that in Australia, and maybe we haven't necessarily done it really well, but you can always get a learning from, not having done something so well. So it's about that engagement, making sure that we're connecting agencies so that the government of Indonesia can then go away and start planning on things like the new capital that's going to move soon, and about how do we connect, making sure that gender, disability and Indigenous and ethnic minority are socially included in that development, whether that's in the workforce, in the co-design, in being beneficiaries of that particular infrastructure project. So I think it's not a short-term turnaround. It's a long-term goal about how do we help influence governments to do infrastructure that is more socially inclusive, including benefiting from the infrastructure. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Hi everyone. Yeah. Thank you so much for today. It's been really, really great. Question for Tony. So you mentioned that DFAT is obviously the leader in the space, and hopefully with the First Nations foreign policy on the horizon, do you think that part of that policy needs to have safeguards for Indigenous people and organisations around engagement? Or do you think it sits more with individual development organisations to make sure recruitment and engagement and that sort of thing is respectful and culturally safe? Just around, things like the Indigenous procurement policy, which, can be done very, very well. But as you mentioned, it could also potentially be tokenistic, going out to fill quotas and that sort of thing.
I'll start by saying I think DFAT should be a leader in this space. I don't think they currently are the leader in this space. We are seeing a lot of direction coming from other organisations, and I think my point is that we need to bring all of that together, bring the experience we have now into one sort of more coordinated approach so that there is some consistency between and across the different organisations working in this space. Do I think that we need to have safeguards? Yes is the short answer, but a longer answer is that we need to understand that we're not just talking about safeguards and ticking boxes along the way and we're doing certain things a certain way. We really need to have a more holistic approach to the way that we engage with Indigenous peoples, whether that be through our engagement and advisory level sort of inputs, that co-design stuff, whether that's in recruitment and engagement of people into roles. I think that there needs to be quite a broad discussion around how does that look in this space, because we're a little bit different in development. People are, leaving their lives here, they're heading off overseas potentially, or they're working in different spaces in different organisations. And the organisations have quite a degree of diversity. Some are doing really well, some have got a little bit further to go. There's different aspects about the way we work, the things that we work on, and all of those things. That diversity means that we really need to start thinking about how do we take all of that diversity and what we work on, and how do we make that all a culturally safe space for Indigenous people to engage in. I don't have a very clear answer that other than that we need to keep pondering that.
Thanks. Hi, Jennifer from Adam Smith. Hi, Braden. We actually manage P4I, so it's been really exciting to sit in the audience and hear and hear about it. I suppose I came from previously the INGO sector, but that also had domestic programs. And I think that the larger INGOs do a lot of that. They have domestic programs that work with Indigenous Australians, and they have their international development arm, and those two things are quite separate. And then, stepping into the managing contractor space, that frankly generally don't work within Australia or very little, and that perhaps have not had nearly the same level of experience of employing and managing and supporting Indigenous employees. Do you think that there is some value maybe in the kind of medium term for those organisations that have done that really well in Australia to be able to share information and knowledge and best practice to the managing contractors that are going to be employing those people in the next 5 years, 10 years?
Is that me?
Yes.
I was just talking about in the previous question about how do we skill up our sector to be more ready for that. And yeah, that recognises and reflects on the fact that we are mostly internationally focused organisations working in this space. We may not necessarily have had that experience. It doesn't mean that the INGOs, even though they may have a domestic program, are doing it well either. So I'll just flag that.
I think also looking back at this slide, the largest portion of that is that area. So, there's a big area of this ecosystem to tap into there. So really important.
Hello, is it on? Yep. Sorry, my name's Linda. I do some work at La Trobe University. You've talked a lot about individuals and more movement of Indigenous people into the space, which is obviously really important. But I wondered how much thinking has yourselves or others have done around taking good practices from Indigenous development into the space. So my experience in working in M&E, I've had the opportunity to observe and be a little bit a part of Indigenous-led evaluation, and frankly, it's been a major shift for me. It's really taught me, probably more in the last 20 years of M&E than any other event. And we're now taking some of that learning into a major study in Indonesia, in fact, with people with disability, and some of the practices and methodologies and ideas and approaches, and in other places. So it's really useful stuff, but it's not written down very much anywhere, the difference. And I thought the same about what you were saying about partnership. There's a whole, there's learning and understanding there as I see a little bit of it and don't really understand it very well. Where's the space to write some of that down or share some of that practice rather than thinking we can do it just by individuals, because that's too much to ask. And also in order to benchmark it. So the biggest barrier we're currently experiencing in trying to take this really good practice and ideas into a big program in Indonesia is DFAT saying it's not M&E, there's no numbers, it doesn't fit this requirement. So having the acknowledgement of that good practice better benchmarked and established and written up in order that we don't have to put up with, frankly, some nonsense, would be amazing in terms of really getting that benefit from Indigenous development. So yeah, I just wonder how much that's sort of been thought of.
Answer this one. So I can talk on our work at NINTI. So NINTI started as an organisation working in Australia in regional and remote communities, and I think that is a really good example of that sharing from the domestic context into international. So working on evaluations, various programs across Australia in some very, very remote communities, across the nation is really important, and that knowledge is always shared in between our domestic team and our international team, which is really important. Around your question around M&E and what that could look like in terms of sharing those learnings, I think we do need to take an exploratory approach. It's a new area. 2015 was really the kickoff in terms of the government working in this space. And it's obviously started to get a little bit more prominent now. But it is a space of learning. Everybody's learning. We're learning. All of us on the panel are learning. Managing contractors learning. DFAT are. So obviously there needs to be some very stringent, reporting. But I think also having that open to say that everybody's learning at the same time is really, really important to make sure that we are doing it right and learning from our experiences, because there will be things that won't work and there will be things that are really successful. Thanks for your question.
I think something that I've found that's been really good in my work is, and within my organisation, I guess, is that as we've been developing Indigenous pathways and learning from the different things we're doing and establishing it, that in my role I've been allowed that time and space to also document it and to share it with colleagues and try and I guess share those learnings across the program. And following our trip up to the Torres Strait, I spent quite a bit of time in the following weeks writing a report and going back and forth between Eva, Pi and I so that we could get that down and we could share it. And it was so well supported internally and really well supported by DFAT to discuss that. And I think that's important because, as Tony's mentioned, there's 11 of us that we know of, I guess, and it's such a small number, and so we're also really, really busy with all sorts of different things. So just trying to find the time to be able to, write something out in the way that we feel comfortable explaining it and telling the story of it can take quite a bit of time. So it's really important and it's valuable when, we're given those opportunities to do that.
So I think we will have time for one more question if anybody has one or not. Yeah, one at the front here. Thank you.
I just wondered Alice Ridge from International Women's Development Agency. I'm wondering, with the First Nations foreign policy commitment, I would love to hear from each of you or any of you on what it would, like thinking 3 years from now, what would it look like or feel like for that to have been a success or to be on the way to success from your perspectives?
It's a very nice question to close on, thank you. I think I'll jump in first since I'm already chatting away. I think that success will be demonstrated by our broader community's engagement in this space. At the moment, we are a few people, but I think it would be fair to say that Indigenous communities and organisations are not really that broadly engaged in development, noting that they have their own priorities and their own demands on their time as well. It would be good, however, for there to be more partnerships between different communities and different organisations, similar to what Alice has been working on, for example, with volunteers and the rangers, to start connecting our different groups in. And I think that will be one of the ways that we'll see a shift as this First Nations foreign policy starts to flow into and impact the way that we work in development as well. That's my hope anyway. 3 years might be optimistic, we'll see.
I'd love to see more people working in the sector, and I'd love that, you know, as we've been forming these, I guess, informal professional networks, the four of us up here work across 3 different countries, but we're connecting and talking about our programs. But I'd love if there was some kind of, you know, formal structure that brought us all together, because as we're kind of meeting and discussing, we're finding other people working in the sector and meeting them, and this week's been great for it because I've met a few additional people that I didn't know. But having that formalised would be fantastic so that we can share information about our programs and what's working and what we're learning. I'd be really excited by that.
I think that's a good place to end, just conscious of time. But thank you everybody for your engagement today. I've really appreciated the questions. If anybody has any further questions, you know, happy to chat, you know, in and around the conference this afternoon. Also, if there are any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room who are comfortable talking with us, really happy to get involved and have conversations with you around building our network. So thank you.